here.
all be me.
I knew I was somewhere on this region, on this stretch of road.
How are you, sir?
These on constantly. Get 'em off.
Testing, testing. We are live on YouTube, so if we can do a mic check with those online really quickly. Kelly, if you want to check your mic. Can anyone hear me? No one can hear me. One moment. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Can we do a quick mic check with those online? We can start with Kelly. Wait, Kelly, can you do that again? We can't hear you, Kelly. No, she's on mute. Yeah. One moment, guys. Sorry. I'm a one-man show over here, so one second.
It worked earlier. It always works out that way.
That's why my least favorite job is the technical audio visual. It's usually the hardest.
Absolutely. That sounded like it worked.
Heard something?
Can you guys hear me online? No. Nope.
And your mic muted on the screen? Looks like. Oh,
Oh, yeah, this is in the room, right? So the icon for her, she's present in the room.
Yes, she's present in the room.
Okay, we can hear you guys now. Thank you. Okay, can you?
Great.
Okay, and you can hear me. Perfect.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Go ahead,
Okay.
Shelley.
Well, wonderful. So welcome to everybody. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome the members. Senior Advisor for Environment Management, Ike White, EM staff, and any members of the public to the Environmental Management Advisory Board's semi-annual public meeting. So just in general, in accordance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, everything said during the course of the proceedings will be made available to the public in the meeting minutes. As a reminder, EMAB members are required to recuse themselves from participation in any meeting, study, recommendation, or other board activity that would have a direct and predictable effect on the companies, the organizations, agencies, or other entities with whom they are personally associated or in which they have a financial interest. So those who are interested in learning more about EMAB are encouraged to visit our website at www.em.doe.gov/EMAB, or contact Kelly Snyder, who is the EMAB's designated federal officer. So let's do a brief introduction of those joining us today, starting with those in the room. And so I can start, and then perhaps if we go to Alyssa and come down. So I'm Shelley Wilson, the current chair of the EMAB. Alyssa?
I am Alyssa Petit, IT extraordinaire and federal coordinator for the EMAB.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Nahigi. I'm the director for the Intergovernmental and Stakeholder Programs at EM headquarters.
Good afternoon, Kristen Ellis, Director of Regulatory, Intergovernmental, and Stakeholder Engagement.
These titles get so long, I want extraordinary after mine. I'm Rob Seifert. I am the Acting Director for Infrastructure Management and Disposition Policy.
And I am David Abelson.
Good afternoon, Jack Craig, EMAB member.
I'm Amy Fitzgerald. I'm the current vice chair of EMAB.
Good morning, everyone. It's Jake Washington. I'm with Jacobs Engineering and I'm a first-year member of the EMAB.
I'm Jay Mullis, Acting Associate Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regulatory and Policy Affairs, so I win that. Although they couldn't put a mic close to me. So
Thank you, Jay. And I'm not responsible for your title. Ike White, Senior Advisor for Environmental Management.
Mike Shapiro, EMAB member, also in my rookie year.
Okay. And those in the back?
I'm Carrie Munter. I'm the Director for Communications at Hanford.
Project Oversight Manager. Frank Stickney, Deputy General Manager.
Michael McAleas, PM Los Alamos, Field Office Manager.
Joel Radburn, PPPO Manager.
Jack Zimmerman, EM's Consolidated Business Center Director.
Mike Whitney, manages Family Operations Office.
Hi, Lee Tucker, EM's Office of External Affairs.
Aaron White, Department of Energy, Office of Regulatory Compliance.
Nicole Nelson-Jean, Associate Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Field Operations, EM.
Good afternoon, Rob Crosby, Chief Engineer for EM.
Anita Icaruso, EM, Director of Communication Services.
So thank you all. And then Alyssa, could you introduce the people joining us by virtual?
I'll just put some order to it. So we'll start with Kelly, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Snyder. I'm the designated fellow officer for EMAB, and I'm so sorry I'm not there in person.
And we'll go to Diane.
Good morning, afternoon. I'm Diane Howard, EMAB member, Richland, Hanford site. Thank you.
Okay, and Fraser.
Yes, Fraser Longcart, longtime EMAB member.
Josiah.
Oh, good morning, everyone, or at least this morning where I am. Josiah Beacom, member of the Nez Perce Tribe, tribal representative, cultural specialist here at the Nez Perce Tribe. Nothing in addition to that, like deputy or vice or executive. Maybe expert here.
Welcome, welcome. And we have Betsy.
Betsy Fornaz, I'm the director of the Office of Waste Materials Management at EMA.
And I think Nancy is also on the line. Nancy?
Hi, everybody. Nancy. I don't have my camera on. Nice to see everybody.
No worries. Thanks. Okay, I'll hand it back to Shelley.
Oh,
About that. Hi, Jim.
well, again, welcome, and it's great to be in person and virtual hybrid. So wonderful to have everyone here today. So I'm delighted that we can start with opening remarks from Ike White. Ike has led the EM program since 2019, and EM has seen tremendous progress under his leadership. So thank you so much. Welcome, Ike.
Thank you, Shelley. And thanks to all the folks who serve on the EMAB, particularly for you and for Amy. I know that we pay you all a fortune for doing this. But in all seriousness, I also appreciate the fact that all of you are doing this because just like most of us on the federal side, you're very interested in public service. You're doing this as a public service. And particularly for those of you taking a leadership role, both with the EMAB itself or working on some of the charter looks, it's a lot of effort, and I really do appreciate that on behalf of the program. So thank you all very much for agreeing to do that. I just wanted to say a couple of things this morning, and then maybe I'll open it up if we have a little bit of time, if there's any questions that you all would have or want to talk about. Just a couple of things, and I will apologize to folks if I deviate from my remarks. I may see some consternation around the room when I do this. The first thing is just to point out that, I continue to be very pleased with the progress that we're making across the country with some of our most difficult challenges. At the moment, for example, we are in the process of starting up two of our most crucial capabilities for dealing with tank waste, both at Idaho and at Hanford, with heating up the melters at Hanford and heating up IWTU at Idaho. Along with the stuff we already have in place at Savannah River. These are all crucial capabilities for dealing with our most difficult challenge. It's a little bit, from an engineering perspective, and I'm an engineer, it's sort of almost one of the more fun parts of the exercise to see these things come together, even when you have the inevitable challenges as you go through the commissioning process. Working through all of those really is an exciting time, both for the program and for the folks who work on these activities, because you're getting to see all the things that you've put so much work on over, in some cases, the course of decades, finally get close to the point where you're able to realize that capability. So I really appreciate all the hard work that's gone into that from the folks at the sites at Hanford and at Idaho. We've also seen success at other places at WIP. We finally have finished our emplacement work in Panel 7 and moved out and closed that. That'll make our future emplacement work at WIP a lot easier, having moved out of that particular panel. So looking forward to beginning to ramp up our shipping rates for WIP, which benefits the entire complex across the department. It benefits, for example, Los Alamos, where we've done a much better job of shipping. One of my goals for shipping from Los Alamos is to make sure that we don't have a backlog at Los Alamos. So of all the sites across the EM complex, the one that we're really focused on ensuring that we don't have a backlog at is Los Alamos, and I think the site there has done a very good job of making sure that that happens. At Oak Ridge, they're continuing to be very focused on making sure that we help our fellow DOE programs move forward to the future. They spent a lot of time over the last decade or a couple of decades working with the community, doing the work on the former enrichment plant, developing the capability for land transfers and economic reindustrialization that I think benefits the entire community. When I was there recently, it was very energizing to see that almost all of that land transfer is now being put to very good use by the community, and so seeing that growth actually happen once the cleanup's done was a very exciting thing for me to be able to do. We're also working very closely with the other programs, the science and NNSA now, to begin to clean off some of the excess facilities in their central campuses so that they can reuse that very limited space to help grow and sustain the very important national security and science missions they have there. Something that's very exciting for not just EM, but also for other programs in the department. Making progress at other sites like Portsmouth. I was just there week before last week. I do lose track at some point. It was last week. Thank you. And we were there celebrating a couple of things. One, it was the 70th anniversary of the founding of the site. So a chance to celebrate what they've done for the country over the course of the past 7 decades. And also getting to see the skyline change with the demolition of Building 326. That was a fairly important event. I was able to join a couple of members of the delegation, Senator Portman and Congressman Winstrip, along with staff from Senator Brown. And it's just really nice to acknowledge all the hard work done by the folks who've made that happen, not just for the most recent project over the course of the past few years, but over the entire 70-year history of the site and all the things they've been able to get done there. As we get a lot of this work done, and there's a lot more examples of this across the country, from West Valley to WIP to Savannah River, it's also important to continue to think about how we manage things in the future. So this is one of those areas where I very much appreciate all the help that you have all given and the advice that you're given. I've read through some of the stuff on workforce and hybrid work environments. Certainly that's something that we have to work through thinking forward. I think there are a couple of key challenges that are really important strategically for the program to be successful going forward. And I think of it as really 3 things. And 2 of them we spent a lot of time talking about this week in the broader context with other folks at the intergovernmental meeting we've had here at the same time. One that is a little bit of a focus of what you all are working on now that's extraordinarily important is people. Because at the end of the day, for a program like EM, you can't be successful if you don't have a whole lot of really great people who are passionately devoted to a very difficult and demanding job and willing to spend their entire careers, and in most cases, working through what it takes to get some of this work done. And so the question of how we keep those folks engaged and motivated, how we attract and retain them, is the most important thing long-term for the program to be successful. So really appreciate the thought and the effort that you all have put into that. We've also spent a little bit of time talking about how we get those folks the resources they need to be successful. We did a very good budget simulation this week as part of our intergovernmental work. I think that went over really well, helping folks understand that process. And so, my role in working with the communities to get alignment around programs, working with OMB and with the Hill to get resources, all of that is very important to ensure that we have the resources we need for the folks that we can get to be successful. The third element of this that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and maybe think about how you all might give me some advice on this in the future, is how do we shape and construct the program in a way going forward that best enables all of those folks with those resources that we get to actually be successful, right? I mean, part of it, you got to have great people, they've got to have resources, and then you've got to have a vision for what you want them to do that actually sets everybody up to be successful with being able to get that vision done. So there are a couple of things in that regard. You guys, I think, are going to get a briefing this afternoon on the budget. You're also going to get a briefing, I believe, on the EM program plan, which is one of those things that I'm thinking about in terms of how we establish a way of pulling together a both short and long-term vision for the program that sets up a framework where folks can be successful. The way I think about the program plan is and I had a little bit of discussion this week with a number of different groups on sort of what we're trying to accomplish. A few years ago, we put out a strategic vision that lays out, this is the known scope of work that we have to get done over the course of the next decade, right? I mean, from a planning perspective, that's about as far out as you can go and have a reasonable level of confidence that that's what your program would look like if you could successfully execute it. As you get further and further away from that timeline, the types of uncertainties that are inevitable, everything from budget to technical difficulties to et cetera, all those types of things, as you keep multiplying them out, begin to get to the point where the level of uncertainty in the program is so great that your ability to really think that you know what's going to happen is somewhat limited. The way I put it or think about it is, at this point in time, we're about 80 years removed from the Manhattan Project, right? And so when I try to place myself back at the time frame that those folks were doing the work they were doing, you ask yourself, would they have had any concept of being able to see what all of us sitting around the table are doing now, right? And the short answer to that question is no, right? I mean, in all seriousness, I sometimes wish they had thought a little bit more on the EM side about some of the things that we're dealing with now. But in hindsight, it isn't reasonable for them to have been able to foresee 80 years into the future and have been able to plan for and deal with all of those uncertainties and changes in regulatory environments and changes in global security environments and all the other factors that have led to what's happened between then and now. As I look forward into the future, we've got, a couple of sites and some aspects of our program, like tank waste at Hanford or some of our soil and groundwater strategy issues, where the future of the program stretches out that far into the future. And so for all of us to think about trying to define what people 80 years from now are going to be sitting around the table doing, right, to close out those programs in 80 years is a little bit of hubris, right? I mean, because it's just not possible. And so how do we create a framework where we can have a vision for what we want to get done, define what it is the program needs to do, but also create it in a way that enables the folks who are in charge of making it happen to have simultaneously both the guideposts they need and the direction they need in order to be able to be successful moving forward, but also that gives them the flexibility and the adaptability to be able to handle those changes in scope and changes in environment and changes in budget and all those other changes that will inevitably happen over the course of a time period like that, so that they'll be able to adapt and change in a way that helps them, that they can do that adaptation and change while maintaining alignment with all of the folks who have such passion about the program and still being able to be set up to be successful. So what we've added to the strategic vision is a couple of things. One, in the very short term, there's the annual priority document. And so that, for me, is a way for us to be able to say, okay, in order for us to be successful with our vision, these are the big picture big ticket items we need to get done over the course of the next year. This helps us communicate with OMB and with the Hill in terms of what it is we're trying to get done with the funding we've been given. And it helps them hold us accountable in terms of whether we're really successful with getting the work done that we said that we would be able to get done with funding on that scale. And I think that has played out very well. The real question of the hard part is how do you define those really far out year guideposts in a way that really sets everybody up to be successful. So what we did with the first version of the program plan is we just took all of the various publicly facing documents we have that attempt to define the program out into the future and pulled them together into one place. So whether that's your site system plans for some of our larger sites, for those of you who have worked with them before, you would know what I'm talking about. You have your site system plans, you have some sites, some larger sites have very specific site program plans already. We have life cycle cost analyses that have gone into our environmental liability numbers. You have regulatory agreements and frameworks that are in place with state regulators. So when you pull all of those things together collectively, what they do for you is they define what your scope of work most likely looks like at most of the sites over the course of the next eight or so decades. So we pulled all of that together. The intent as we go forward is to revise this every so often. Haven't figured out exactly how often yet. Maybe this is one of those things that you guys might want to think about. But revise it every so often to update it. And maybe the very first update, one of the things that I would like to start adding to this is the concept of what sorts of options that we have that exist relative to dealing with those work scopes. So right now what we have is just, what is the plan that we folded into our environmental liability numbers, our regulatory frameworks. But what I would also like to begin laying out in these things so that folks can see them both internally and externally is a sense of, what sort of variability exists in the program based on changing some of the key variables associated with that program. And so at most sites, it's one of two variables. It's either what the funding profile looks like, and at some sites, that's probably the most important variable because the work scope is fairly set. At other sites, it might not just be the funding profile, but it also might be the work scope itself, either because there's a lot of uncertainty associated with the work scope and that has to be defined over time, or because there's a lot of different options in terms of how you get something done on the work scope. And so therefore, there may be some options that affect what the ultimate program might look like depending on which of those work scopes and which of those approaches that you choose. I mean, Hanford is an obvious example of this with the tank waste program there. And so part of the reason for doing that from my perspective is so that we can begin to have an approach that is both flexible and adaptable, but also is put out in a way that helps us internally manage and understand where we're going, and then externally be able to communicate what kinds of options that we're considering and thinking about early enough and in a time frame where folks who want to engage with the program can also have an opportunity to engage and think about those options as well. I mean, often what we do on the federal side with really complicated decision-making is we like to hold it all internal as long as we can until we're really confident we know exactly what we want to do, and then we go talk about it. But you know, I think that isn't always as successful as we would like to be, because that is very frustrating for all the folks who want to engage with the program. And what I think we found recently is that when the opportunities where we've stepped back and actually gone out and tried to be a lot more transparent a lot earlier in the process, that requires a lot more effort and a lot more communication, but ultimately I think it pays off in terms of our ability to get alignment going forward into the future as you actually begin to settle on what those options are. It's also important that we begin to keep some of those options open until you need to actually make some decisions, right? You don't have to make every decision for an 80-year program right now. One of the more interesting thought pieces I got recently was, I think it was a couple of versions ago, of what the review of the National Academies is doing of the supplemental low activity study that our national labs is doing. And the academies have pointed out that the department ought to think carefully about trying to have a solves everything plan up front for a program this complicated and large, and maybe you ought to step back and think about solving the immediate problem and giving yourself the space to solve the rest of it as the program evolves, because of the time frame that you're talking about. That'll give you much more opportunity to take advantage of technology innovation, budget changes, all kinds of things. And so you're in a better position if you actually set yourself up to be more flexible and adaptable. So the program plan is the way for us to do that. So when you see Rev Zero now, all you really see is something that captures what most of you here already know, right? Which is what is the plan of record. But what I wanted to, and you'll get briefed on that this afternoon, but what I wanted you to think about it was in the context of it being a living document that eventually begins to capture not just the plan that we have now, but particularly for the long-range items, what kinds of options do we have for how we might get that work done? And how do we begin to fold those in there that help in a way that helps everybody understand them from an external perspective so that they can provide us input, and for us to be able to use that to be able to do more rigorous internal program planning and development as well, which is something that we've had recommendations on that from GAO and others. So you all will get a briefing on that, and so appreciate your thoughts on that as well. All of that collectively for me sets up a conversation that Jay and I had earlier today. And this is the part where we go off script badly.
And it's all my fault.
And it's all Jay's fault. So it's not actually my fault. So for those of you who are looking a little nervous, you can blame Jay. It is not me. One of the things that this brings to mind for me, right, is the need to have, and we've talked a little bit about this with other groups this week, the need to have an adaptive framework in a number of different areas, right? I mean, for those of you who've been regulators before, you probably have a very specific thought in your head when it comes to the concept of adaptive management, right? But from my perspective, what I'm really thinking about is how to set up an entire system that lets us do adaptive management. Because what I think we found is that we can get, whether it's from a technology perspective for something that's difficult and complicated and going to take forever, or whether it's a regulatory challenge for an 80-year program, it is much easier for us to get alignment and to try to figure out what we need to do in the short term, and it is much harder for us to do this in the really long term. But efforts to do all of it at once, particularly on the long-term side, often set up a framework and a dialogue and a way of engagement that really hinders progress in the short term. From a regulatory perspective, you end up fighting mostly about the out-year stuff and not about the short-term stuff. But all the discussion and the disagreement over the long-term stuff keeps you from coming to a consensus around the stuff you really could agree to in the short term. Same thing on the technology development side, right? So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to really think about how we do technology development. So there are a number for programs that stretch out this large, one aspect of what you need to be adaptive is you need to have some mechanism in place where you can continue to grow and learn and find out the kinds of things that help you make that adaptation from a technical program perspective in a way that gives you an opportunity to have innovation or better ways of doing things or faster ways of doing things or cheaper ways of doing things or more effective or whatever. And so, we've done 3 things recently, and maybe having you guys take a look at the combination of those 3 things and think about what they mean for the program and how we most effectively use them going forward. One is there's 2 areas where it occurred to me that I have the best shot of making a really good case for why we need to have an effective R&D program for cleanup. One was the tank waste program at Hanford, which is just so enormous and will take so long, it almost seems obvious to me that it shouldn't require explanation in terms of why you need to do some R&D and technology development to sort of make that program move forward. And in fact, I have not yet found anybody who's told me that I don't really need to do that, right? The really win does speak for itself. So the labs have been taking a look at what a roadmap might look like. They've done a very good job, I think, of mapping out what some of the key areas of R&D that we could do that would pay off. We've even gotten to the point where we're looking at what some quick wins associated with that might be. Well, if we were going to try to do something quickly where we could demonstrate the benefit of going down this roadmap, what would those areas be? And so I think that has reached the point where, having a different set of eyes take a look at it might be an interesting thing and might get some useful feedback in terms of how we might deploy it going forward. The second piece of it is, when you look across the entire EM complex, the one thing that tends to be the very last thing that you finish doing is soil and groundwater, right? Just because of the nature of cleanup activities. And it's also from a community perspective, and if I lived in one of these communities, from my perspective, it would also be one of the most important things, right? So from a community risk perspective and environmental risk perspective, at the end of the day, so it's really groundwater, right? That's the thing that folks think about the most from an environmental risk perspective. And it's also one of the last things that you sort of get done with as you do a cleanup program, because the first thing you're focused on is removing the source terms, and then you deal with what was created by that. So we've had the national labs working to look at creating a soil and groundwater strategy across the program. And we've been doing different pieces of R&D and modeling related to groundwater at different sites, but the idea is to begin to pull that together and think about what more investment we can make and what we should be doing in terms of a strategy that would help enhance the effort for everybody and help us leverage resources. The third thing we've been doing is pulling together a look at headquarters about how we manage the entire R&D program from a corporate perspective. So we've had an R&D review ongoing that takes a look at how we've recently been managing our technology development and other R&D activities to think about whether there's a more effective way to integrate the very late stage technology development that has typically been managed by our sites or our site contractors with some of the earlier stage R&D efforts, or the broader efforts that were being done at a headquarters level, and how do we marry those in a way that's a little bit more effective and help sites leverage the work that they're all doing. So I think we've sort of reached the point where maybe if you pull all of these together and think about them, there may be other ideas of how we blend all that together so that from a technical perspective we can also be more adaptive. So the really big picture, as you think about the idea that I laid out earlier in terms of an adaptive regulatory framework, right, and an adaptive technical framework, and marry that with an adaptive program framework, right? I mean, can we set up something that from a fiscal perspective, from a technical perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from a stakeholder engagement perspective, helps us build confidence, increase our transparency, increase the odds that we can be successful with it by setting up expectations correctly, where the expectations for success are really driven around the short term, and the longer term things are more goalposts and guidelines, right? And where you try to set up your hard discussions and your hard agreements around the stuff that's actually going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years. So, you guys have taken a look at some of given me some advice in the past about how we work better with our regulators and with our other stakeholders. And so thinking about it in that context, I think would be an interesting thing to do. There are regulatory adaptive frameworks that are out there, right? As I mentioned earlier, on the program side, from a technical perspective, I kind of laid out what we're talking about. And I guess the thought here is how can you merge all of these things to have a management framework that takes all of that into account and actually also looks forward in a way that is simultaneously more rigorous in the short term and more flexible in the long term. So anyway, that was a thought piece we had at lunch. You guys are all really, really smart. Many of you are much smarter than I am. You all have an incredible amount of experience. So I thought that's a conversation that maybe ought to go just beyond Jay and myself in an area where I could really just use some conceptual out-of-the-box thought and thinking. And so I decided to sort of bring that up and see what you guys might might think and give you a chance to think about what aspect of that you would be interested in taking a look at and perhaps providing me some advice. So with that, I will quit going off script, and I will revert back to my script and say that I'm done, and I'm happy to take any questions that all of you might have.
So thank you so much, and we're glad you shared a lot of your off-script thoughts and your successes of the program. So I'll just say that as somebody with their roots in liquid waste, I'm just thrilled that EM is at a watershed moment with treatment in place in some fashion everywhere, and so that's just remarkable. And so I always like to acknowledge just the great progress, and truly it is a watershed moment, I think, for liquid waste across the nation. And I'll just give you one other thing. I got a lot of feedback. I got to see a lot of my former state counterparts, and what they told me about the intergovernmental meeting is that budget session that you all did, they loved it. Everybody that I spoke with. So it was just a tremendous feedback on that piece. But anyway, anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Ike. Every time I listen to you, and I think we've listened to you several times over the last few days, I learned something new. One of the things, as we've discussed, that is a little bit of a piece of the puzzle that people don't quite understand in our community is the transition from EM to LM and how that's going to occur at big sites. I know there's a lot of experience at some of the smaller sites, but in your strategic planning for the next 10 years, do you have any thoughts that you could share with us on how Carmelo's going to do that?
Well, I mean, I will just say that that's actually a really good question, and I know the folks who are here this week with Stigwig have been very much focused on this question of long-term stewardship, and partly in response to input from them, the entire department has put together a long-term stewardship working group where we've been trying to pull together and think about just that very specific question. So I got a briefing a couple of weeks ago from the team that's composed of folks in NNSA and science and NE and LM and EM. And you know, they're beginning to work through some ideas in terms of how we become more effective with that on just that very question. Because, you know, ultimately it's from an EM perspective, EM does the cleanup, right? And then we get it done. And then once the site is cleaned up and you're really just into the point where you want to monitor and make sure that it was effective, then, you know, you have this transition to LM and they do the long-term stewardship and monitoring. But it becomes a lot more complicated than that when you start thinking about other parts of the program like NNSA and NE, and we're getting to the point in the program where there's actually a lot more of that sort of NNSA to LM possibility for transfer or you know, in some cases, not really LM, but, you know, within programs, EM to NNSA or even vice versa. And so the group has had some good ideas in terms of how we work together more effectively, capturing best practices and MOAs and MOUs and trying to document a lot of both the process and the desired principles and the desired outcomes. Also thinking about how we pulled together some of the tools from a technology or database perspective to enable us to be successful and to better communicate what we're doing when we get to that long-term stewardship stage as well. And so I don't have an easy answer for you other than to say it's a good question and that it's something that we've been working on, and I know that the folks in Stigwig have also been very interested in it. So there's if you guys are interested, I'd certainly be happy to have the long-term stewardship working group give you the same briefing they gave me in terms of what they're thinking and what they're trying to do.
Can I have just a quick follow-up on that?
Sure.
Just a quick follow-up. And I'm looking at the screen at Fraser because I know he was involved and Diane, and I can't remember how many recommendations ago, but there was a recommendation that the EMAB made to you on establishing a transition office within EM to start to tackle this very issue. And I think, did we settle on that group would basically be, I think, housed in 3. It might have been 4, but I think it was in 3. But it was something that we did offer a recommendation on. I don't know if Fraser or Diane remember how many years ago, but it was within the last couple of years, I want to say 3 years or so, maybe longer than that. I lose track of time.
I have it down as 2020.
No, I remember that, and that's actually a good point, and so I appreciate your bringing that back up to me, because one of the things that I think we could ask the long-term stewardship working group to do is to pull that into what they're doing and think about how we fold that in and take a look at that. So I think, Rob, you are our person for that, so if you don't mind taking that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm actually taking over the chair of the Litzwood group in January, so, and I was going to speak to, as a part of the EM4 update, a little bit later this afternoon, more of the, that transition process. So we have made some pretty significant strides this year in that. We can go into it now or later on this afternoon, whatever works for you guys.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions or any from our online members? Okay, you, David?
So just a macro question, and I want to try to ask this as broadly as possible. How do we anticipate the Justice 40 initiative will affect the arc of cleanup?
So at Los Alamos, we're sort of doing a pilot of this now, right? And I think, I look at this in two ways. I think historically, some of the goals of what you're trying to get out of the Justice 40 effort, the program has always been about doing, right? I mean, the whole program itself is really about addressing the environmental legacies of the past, and I mean, sort of the nature of the program itself is about addressing all of those impacts and issues that have been created, all of them, right? And so to that extent, I don't know that the effort changes that question. It's just sort of so the big picture goal of the program itself, I don't think actually get changed. I think there are some aspects of how we do it, however, that could be impacted fairly significantly, but we have yet to see how that is. And so, at Los Alamos, for example, what we've decided to do is, under our pilot, is to have a really enhanced engagement with all of the communities around the site as we actually develop what our long-term cleanup program is going to be there. Because we're at a phase at Los Alamos, for example, where you've gotten a lot of the work that you have to do done, or at least defined well enough that you know what it's going to be. And a lot of the work that we potentially have into the future is work that has a lot of variability in terms of what the ultimate work scope might be, right? Which is, I think, where you get to the trajectory and the arc of the cleanup program, because what you're talking about in a lot of cases are material disposal areas, across either at the lab or nearby and adjacent to the lab. And there are options and ideas for how you might reach what you decide is an end state, ranging from just cap and cover and you're done with them, all the way to completely full retrieval and move the waste somewhere else and then backfill and do something else entirely. All of those things carry a lot of different pros and cons. And so, rather than take the historical department approach of we'll figure out what the right thing to do is and then we'll convince everybody that was in fact the right thing to do, one of the things we're trying to do with our environmental justice effort is really go out with a very transparent set of conversations with all of the different groups who would be impacted by this cleanup work, and have those conversations with them at some level of detail about what those options and alternatives look like, and what the pros and cons and the risks are for different ways of dealing with those aspects of the cleanup program, and get all of their feedback up front, right, before we start the, wrapping up final decisions on some of this stuff. And so far, the feedback I've gotten from the communities around Los Alamos is it's been a very successful effort, at least in terms of the engagement, right? We'll see as we progress this in terms of where we get to the stage of actually defining what the arc of that cleanup program looks like, and whether the arc of that cleanup program ends up looking any different than it would have looked like if we hadn't had this level of engagement. I don't know. I mean, I can't predict that in advance on what that delta might look like. But the approach to deciding what that arc looks like is different, right? Whether the arc itself ends up being different or not, I don't know.
Thanks for that question, David. Any other questions? So I will say that I'm really excited about your thoughts on the adaptive framework. And It's interesting, I was talking with an EPA regulator about concepts of adaptive management, and we were just remarking that it's really funny you say that, and people have an opinion, a strong opinion, one way or the other. But yet, we were saying that if you look at what really works, it's some form of an adaptive framework. And the fact that you're thinking of systemizing that is tremendous. So we can certainly talk later in the EMAB, but I think that would be a great opportunity. So, and just really am, I think it's great that you're thinking in that direction. So, well, I'll just say one last chance for questions from the EMAB before we move into the next topic. So, okay. Well, well, thank you so much for your remarks, and really appreciate your presence with us. And so we'll move into the next session, which is the report on recruitment and retention. And so Jim Rispoli, who is joining us virtually, he'll now present the draft EMAB report on recruitment and retention of the EM workforce.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to all our colleagues on the EMAB. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you, but I'd like to say hello to all the EM staff members who are giving up their time to be here for this meeting as well. So thank you. If you could go to the next slide, please. I won't read it, but our charge basically is how can we improve the way EM recruits, retains, and develops its people. And also there's a little bit of an inclusion there, if you notice, about contractors on the bottom line on your screen. And we will address both the federal employees and the contractors. Next slide, please. We had several meetings of a subcommittee. The participating EMAB members on that subcommittee are shown on the left. And it would not have been successful for us in our discussions if we had not had tremendous input and discussion with participating DOE staff who are shown on the right. We've had several meetings, as I say, and much of what we were initially conceptualizing was refined as a result of discussions with DOE staff. So we thank all of them for their participation. Next slide, please. Okay, we will have several slides on recruitment. And again, I don't want to read these slides, but just in the way of format, the report itself, the report document, has discussion, of course, that precedes the recommendations that our group came up with to present to the full EMAB and to all who are participating today. So we're only looking at the recommendations, not the full report, which has been distributed to you. But basically what we realized early on was that EM did have a program at one point in time that was similar to a basic program to recruit people at the university level. And Kelly Schneider herself was brought into DOE under such a program. It was not the EM specific one. But as it turns out, one of the DOE staff that we had with us was a product of a program called the EM Professional Development Corps. And so we looked at updating that, and we learned that the target could be like at the GS 13 grade. For those who are not familiar with the general service pay grades, these are the professional career tracks, if you will. They're called GS grades. Typically, you start at a 5 or 7 level, very junior, and GS 12 or 13 are basically the full experience level. And so we were looking at targets at the GS 13 level, and then we learned from EM that you've had a lot of success in filling positions in the accepted service band. And accepted service is a way where you can specifically bring people on for their technical expertise, if you will, no matter what the area is, and that has been another successful vehicle for EM. So we're looking at and recommending a program where you would have target positions that would be at the GS-13 or a similar EK level, K level, at specific locations in specific career areas, both STEM and non-STEM. And to do this, we would need a team of recruiters. In the past, these were people who actually, they were not HR people necessarily, they were augmented with HR people, but they were basically people who performed the technical tasks and the engineering tasks that EM performs. And they would visit various universities and look for opportunities at various universities, including minority-serving universities, and universities who have in their program, the appropriate specialties that EM needs. Next slide, please. So the idea would be to offer each recruit a career track in their GS series or a suitable EK designation. There would be, this was stressed to us, item 4, that there was a very well-organized orientation program of 4 weeks long held at the Forestall building in the past. And those who went through that program had very good comments about that program. It was very well organized, again, to present various aspects of what EM does and how each person would fit into the mission of EM based upon what they were doing. It was also discussed that having a mentor for each recruit, each new recruit, who would stay with them throughout the early stages of their career development would be beneficial. These would be volunteers who are suitable and motivated to actively assist and guide the new employees. And it would be especially important because the career development program, the new recruits would not be in one location. They would move to several different locations, perhaps sites and headquarters. So they would be introduced to different locations, but also different people, and the mentor would provide continuity for that new recruit as they go through that process. Next slide, please. Moving on to employee development, we were talking about having a rotational development plan, as I mentioned just a moment ago, where each recruit would go through various positions at various sites. We heard from some, for example, that even though they wound up at headquarters eventually, they really enjoyed being at the site because as they worked it, they could see things happen. They could go into the field and see things happen. And so that would be important to have a rotational assignment that builds the depth for each employee as they rotate through and gain experience. And again, they would be guided by the mentor. The mentor in consultation with the supervisor at the target location, which is the ultimate employment location, would have to develop a development plan to include not only those rotational assignments, but coursework. What would be important to that particular GS series or that particular employee? It might be project management. It might be other things in a more technical or engineering sense. Next slide, please. And again, a leadership development program would be created. There already is quite a good SES program, or for potential SES members, where people are identified early on as having the potential to be a member of the senior executive service. Well, we were thinking of a program similar to that and incorporating many of the aspects of that, where leaders are identified and offered a 2 or 3 year program to include courses in leadership, EM-specific technical challenges, and project and contract management. And this program need not be limited to just members of the Environmental Management Professional Development Corps, but rather could be made available to all EM federal employees. And when we talk about development, I think it's very consistent with what I shared with us earlier, that we can't do any of the things that EM has to do, either in the near term or long term, without people and finding good people and then retaining good people. So this could go a long way toward the retention of the good people. So the next slide, please. On retention, we recommend that there be a survey of all employees who are still in DOE, not just EM, who were accessed through the original EMPDC to find out the good and the bad, the areas that could be improved, what caused them to stay, what caused them perhaps to leave EM, why did people they know leave EM? We heard of a few people who had left EM because they felt they were disillusioned. And so this would help to identify, again, the good areas and the areas for improvement. Also, we were talking about other incentives, such as for STEM and non-STEM people, a vision of what could be attained in their career. In other words, have opportunities for them to see what job openings would be available. We learned that EM did a kind of a survey or an audit of its employee base, and if I recall the number, there were only like 7 employees under the age of 35. So obviously, recognizing that the cleanup program is not a program that will be finished in 5 or 10 or 15 years, we have to have a way to retain our employees far better than we have to this point. So this would be one of the key elements in doing that as well. And then all EM employees should be provided periodic updates on the benefits of federal employment. Many don't realize when they first join that all their benefits, such as leave and whatever GS grade they're in, are transportable. Their health plan, their vacation accrual, training and development. And so there are opportunities to advance both within EM and within DOE, but also in other federal agencies. And that should be a major attraction point, we would think, for retention of employees. Next slide, please. The charge includes contractor employees. And we did discuss contractor employees and realized that some of them are larger and well-established companies, especially the EPCs, such as Fluor, Bechtel, Parsons, and so forth, that they have mature programs for their own methodology of recruitment, development, and retention. But some of what we are suggesting might be of value to smaller companies, perhaps small business firms that are engaged in EM work. And so we thought that they could consider the recommendations that I've just been going over with you all. Next slide, please. We had another couple of recommendations. I'm still the chair of the Federal Facilities Council at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I'm the only non-federal employee on this Federal Facilities Council. There are 25 agencies that are members of the Federal Facilities Council, and DOE is a full member. As such, all of their activities are accessible and open to any federal employees in the Department of Energy. So we have an oversight committee, which is the one I chair, and on that oversight committee, we have probably among the more reliable representatives have been people from DOE, but not from EM. We also have 5 subcommittees. One of pertinence, one is a subcommittee on personnel practices and retention, and another subcommittee is looking at the office space of the future. How are federal agencies adapting to the change in work location practices that were driven by COVID? So all of these discussions and learning about how other agencies are coping with these issues would be available to EM, and it would not cost EM anything to designate people who would be interested in going to those meetings. Most of them now are virtual. Some are once again hybrid. They're all right there in DC. And so we would encourage EM to consider having a more active role in the Federal Facilities Council. And then once engaged in the Federal Facilities Council, then EM would be able to see additional methods that other agencies are using in the areas of things like recruitment, development, and retention, as well as how do they plan to deal with which employees go back to the office, how often, what is the new model for things of that nature. Next slide, please. And that's basically a recap, and I thank you for your time, and I think we have enough time now for questions and discussion, not just for me, but for anyone who served on this subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Really appreciate that. Do we have any questions for Jim?
I'll offer a thought.
Please.
Hey, Jim, Jake Washington here. Just one thought,
Hi, Jake.
How you doing? So at one point, our committees did get together, and Jim came onto our committee because I believe there was a nexus in retention, obviously, recruiting between how you treat the hybrid workspace. And people are being lost and retained based on the policies and how that's being set up. So Jim, we just kind of scratched at it, I think, but I think there's a follow-on effort to really consider as you implement hybrid, and we can talk about that in a moment, how that factors into the choices, why people stay. There's people in different age categories, new employees, what have you. Just kind of looking at that, because I really think there's a nexus here between as you recruit and develop these programs, if you're also applying policies in the hybrid back-to-work process that are not meeting the needs of some of these folks, you may lose them along the way as you develop in these programs. So Jim, I don't know if you had a thought on that. You came in our meeting, I thought it was insightful, but we just really scratched at it.
Yes, Jacob, thank you for that comment. It's very pertinent, and one of the things we did discuss was that not all positions will have the ability to work other than at a specific work location. For example, some of the site positions that involve direct contractor work interface, the feds would have to be there on site. And so we recognize that as EM, if they choose to do so, as they develop this program or a modern version of it, they would have to consider, even during the rotations. Now, it was stressed that the orientation should be face-to-face at Forest Hall, 4 weeks in person, with the various people from EM being there to share what they want to with the new recruits. But Jake, we did recognize the challenge that EM will have as they develop their rotational assignments and even the permanent locations, that there's now another dimension that has to be added that wasn't there 10, 15 years ago, and that is, will this permanent location, wherever it may be, permit remote work? And as one example, I've been involved in almost all the Federal Facilities Council subcommittee on cybersecurity because it's such a big deal. And the experts who have spoken to us are from the Idaho National Lab. And one of them who spoke to us lives full-time in Texas. So obviously, at this position, he can do everything he needs to do from his location. But that's not going to be the case for everyone. So that, again, just adds another dimension to the challenge for EM in developing a new program. And perhaps a survey, as we suggested, a survey of employees might include questions on that. How would EM best accommodate preferences for either hands-on works, like working direct interface with contractor performance versus virtual work? So it's not an easy answer to your question. Maybe the question is not an easy answer. We did discuss it, and that's what I could offer.
Thank you, thank you. So I know this was a compilation of work from the whole subcommittee, so, and we may have had some other members join, but I know Jack and Diane and Amy and Josiah that I saw at the beginning joining us today. Do y'all have any other insights or any other thoughts you'd like to highlight during this portion?
I think Jim did a good job of summarizing our recommendations. I don't have anything else to add.
So I had a couple of questions, if that's okay. One question that I had sort of, I guess, Jake, you brought it up because I was personally the product of a very, very structured early career development program at a different government agency, and I agree with the recommendation in that regard. Because I think it was a very helpful way to go from being a college student to understanding what it meant to do a federal job, right? I mean, it was in my case, it was a 3-year program. And so that's certainly something I think we should take a look at. I would be interested, one question would be whether you guys have seen examples of programs you think would be good for EM to look at as a model. The other question in that regard, though, and this gets to the question that you asked, is sometimes I don't really know whether this is just because I'm so old and don't really think about how to do this anymore, or whether it's because it's just structurally difficult. But when I try to put myself back in that position again, which is really hard 30 years later, I find myself struggling to figure out how it could possibly have been effective if we had tried to do it remotely, right? I just don't know how I ever would have been able to get what I got out of that program if I hadn't been able to have my mentor be 2 office doors down and have been able to just roam the halls and interact with people on a nearly constant basis with all the probably endless questions I had as a recently graduated college student. And so if you guys sort of look at this question of whether it's possible to, how much of it you can do. I mean, how do you pull this together in a way that satisfies what I suspect is, if we surveyed folks, what I suspect would be a strong desire from some of the younger folks to have a more remote option available, with what I think many of our experiences would have been that you all are probably just like I am and can't imagine how that would have worked, right? So did you guys put any thought in how you would marry that?
Honestly, please go ahead.
One of the other members, if you like.
Go ahead, Jim. You probably.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and don't say you're old. You're not.
I'm probably older than you.
But I think that what we heard from those who were recipients or past participants in programs like this was, number one, they stressed the importance of the in-person 4-week orientation in Forrestal, and how meaningful that was and how well organized it was. And also then the in-person rotation to different sites. I think what we would say in response is that the target position would have to be defined. And not everyone would want the same target position, whether it was at a specific location or had remote capability. Not everyone would perhaps want the same. There might be some people who really want to move to Oak Ridge or really want to move to Los Alamos, whereas others, like the fellow I mentioned at INL, is happy to work from Texas. And so I think, thinking back on our discussions, the idea would be that each target position would define the parameters, whether it could be a remote-only target position, where the person could be anywhere in the country and still support that mission at that location, or whether it would have to be on-site, again, because of more direct engagement with work being performed at a site. And some of the people we spoke to, they felt that those jobs were the most impactful to them, where they could physically see things happen, and that the ones where they were in an office were not as important. But not everyone will have that same perspective. So I think that the idea would be a program that has that flexibility built in, with the exception that the rotational assignments would be in person and the orientation at Forrestal would be in person. I hope that addresses, and maybe other committee members would like to chime in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Jake has a thought, and then I see Diane will go to next after, with her hand raised. So Jake?
Honestly, I didn't have much to add. I was going to say, Ike, that we just really scratched at it. That's why I used that term. But, as I think about it, and I think about it, applying it to my business where I work, we work through 100 and some offices in the U.S. and other places. And what I've been trying to do, and honestly, to a point you just made, we lost some very young people who left because they wanted more in office. They wanted the absolute opposite of what we thought. And as I brought more leaders together, it's more complex and diverse, and we kind of get these thoughts around what people expect, but that deep understanding and that survey, and I know it's a massive effort to do that. But what I was trying to do is get certain leaders, because I think leaders have to lead and set an example. And to Jim's point here, if you're going to have all of these variabilities where folks might land in one place, you're going to have some lay down everywhere you are with some watch, as a Navy term. Some folks are going to have to stand and watch. They're going to have to be on those locations to be that face-to-face. And, I got a distributed number of leaders in different disciplines. I'm an architect. But if there's 20 interns who want to come and there's 3 architects and 3 electricals, I don't have to be there as the architect all the time. I'm looking for rotational leadership amongst those mid-level leaders to be in those geographic places, understanding where we're onboarding, to get that right balance of face-to-face and hybrid, and dispel some of the rumors around what we think people want, because I found out in several examples what I thought was the case was exactly the opposite. So that survey really is important, and trying to drive it down into the organization around the leaders who lead those people. Because I think the headquarters perspective is usually too high to understand, and so you really got to distribute it down and try to touch people where they work and find that right balance, I think.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah.
And Diane?
I concur that there's really no clear one option. You've got to work around the leadership, and you've got to work with the person that's applying for the position or for the position. But I also just wanted to comment that a thank you to the subcommittee members, but as you can tell by his answers today, I just want to extend a note of thanks to Jim Rispoli for his literal passion around this topic and his tremendous depth and breadth of information that he brought forward to the subcommittee members. It was very helpful to all of us, so I just wanted to extend the thanks on behalf of the subcommittee. Thank you.
I agree. Thanks to Jim. Any other thoughts from the EMAB, the subcommittee members? Amy?
Just a quick follow-up. I totally agree with Diane that Jim's expertise in this area was just phenomenal. And one of the things that is evident, there's a lot on both these topics. There is a lot of people working on them. And when he talked about the Federal Facilities Council and all the work that's being done, there is not, there's so much information out there that I think is helpful without having to go out and recreate the wheel. I don't want to put Nicole on the spot, but she gave a terrific talk yesterday at lunch on the investment that DOE is making in universities around I think 2 in Tennessee and at each of our complexes. And it struck me that that's something that, looking at that investment that DOE is making, how can we link that to recruitment and retention in bringing that, those individuals into the program? So I enjoyed your talk. Like I said, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but that just struck me. That's something that we should take a look at.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Amy.
Hey,
Yes.
just sort of one more quick follow-up question. I'm sorry, I'm killing the timeline.
No worries.
But I mean, this is obviously a really important subject for the program. And one of the other recommendations that struck me was something I also personally benefited from, which was a mid-career development program, right? But in my experience, most recently, with trying to get something like that started, one of the things that has been more difficult than I would have expected is recruiting people to participate in it, because the target audience that you often want to participate in that program perceives themselves as being too busy to do such a thing, right? And their supervisors often perceive them as being too busy to do such a thing. And so how do you, did you guys look at sort of, in order for it to be really successful, you got to be bringing in the right target audience, right? Because that sort of program is most successful when what you have is the right group of people participating in it. And the question of how do you not just set up the right program, but also make sure that you are convincing the right people to be part of it is something that, when I've done this in the past, I've struggled with.
Good question.
I don't think we discussed that specifically on our subcommittee, but, I understand exactly what you're saying. I think perhaps one way to make it attractive is, give a lot of fanfare to the rollout of a leadership development program and make it a program where people either can self-nominate or be nominated, one or the other. And that way you're not excluding anyone. A person doesn't have to wait to be nominated by someone else. But if the program is perceived as being, having a great benefit of going through the opportunities to hear from others, to perhaps even have virtual rotational type things, whatever it includes, perhaps you would be able to entice people to both self-nominate and accept a nomination if it's offered to them. But I understand exactly what you're saying. Sometimes the people you really want just say, I can't do it, I don't have the time, I have too many responsibilities, I travel too much, whatever the answer is. I think a big part of the answer has to be the way the program is packaged and the way people are perceiving that program and the value it would afford.
Thank you.
Thanks.
David?
The question just raised is very interesting to me personally. I'm 56 years old. I've been working in the EM program in one capacity or another since I started working as congressional staffer in 1995. So I have, 27 years working in EM, work with LM and stuff. Been an independent consultant now for finishing up 16 years. And the thing that you're talking about, it's almost like a self-motivation, because just recently I reached out to a friend and said, I need some help trying to understand how I look differently in what I'm doing. And I think on some level, and people, it sort of struck people as odd that, well, you've been doing this for so long, why would you do that? And I think for me on a personal level, there was just something that woke up in me one day and said, I need to think differently. I need someone to bring someone in to help me think about this. And that's what I'm sort of early in the process of. I think in part from my personal experience is just having that awareness that there's actually can be some benefit to people who are far into their careers to say there is value added by calling on your friends, on your colleagues, people that are, that can mentor you. The person that I picked was my freshman college roommate, we're contemporaries. But there's just something about that is sort of going against the grain. But to have people understand that those options exist and present opportunities, I think that there's a lot of people that would jump at that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Mike.
I worked at EPA for many years, and we had a number of efforts at mid-career programs like this. I think they often worked well where you weren't like permanently removing the person for long periods of time from their ongoing responsibilities, so they sort of had the feeling of safety that they weren't being pushed into something, but they had shorter term details that gave them the opportunity to expand their capabilities and capacities and learned about other activities that might benefit them. Now, sometimes, especially at places dispersed as DOE, where you have remote locations that might not be as easy, but often we find that people, in the same position, in mid-career type positions, realize themselves are kind of getting a little bit stale and burned out, and if they're not sort of putting their whole career on the risk, are willing to take a little bit of a chance on new opportunities and broadening their engagement and their exposure to other parts of the agency and other opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mike. I think Jim also had a comment, and then we'll look to see if there's a motion.
Well, all I was going to add to that is that, again, I think it depends on how you package the program. And I offer two last thoughts. Jake and I both come from a common background in the Navy, and they offered courses at Port Hueneme right through our careers at various touch points. Sometimes it was when you were promoted to the next grade. Sometimes it was in the middle of an assignment. You would take off 2 weeks and go to a developmental course at Port Hueneme. And then I would also offer that we have a lot to learn from other federal agencies, as was just brought up. If EM started to participate in the appropriate committees of the Federal Facilities Council, I think personally that the benefits are enormous. For example, I tune into every meeting I can sign into virtually on workspace management, on cybersecurity, and on personal practices. I do. And all it costs me is the hour on my screen to participate wherever I happen to be. And so there's such an opportunity to find out what lessons learned there are from other agencies, not just NAVFAC, as Jake and I learned when we were going through the Navy system, but all these other civilian agencies and what they do and how they motivate their employees. I think that would be a big part of it, would be participating in the FFC. And I thank you all for your time. This is, as I said earlier on, to you know, we can't do this without people. And it's more than just getting the people, it's developing them and keeping them. And so I think that, you know, it was a pleasure to work with our subcommittee. Everybody had a passion for it, not just me. And I really enjoy doing this, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So let me check with you first, though, Ike, because we're here to offer help to you. So did you have any other questions?
No, it was a very helpful discussion. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate all the hard work that went into that.
Thank you. So is there a motion for this recommendation?
I'll make a motion for approving it.
Thank you, Jack. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Amy. So we'll call for a vote then. All in favor of passing the recommendation? Alyssa, did you capture a count? Okay. Okay, and any opposed? Okay, so it looks like the recommendation passes. So again, it's been said before, but Jim and the whole subcommittee, thank you all so much. A tremendous amount of work, and very pleased to have that put forward and passed. Thank you. So moving on, Celeste Green will now present the draft EMAB report on EM's hybrid work environment.
Actually, Shelley, I'm going to start, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So unfortunately, I don't think Celeste is able to join us. She had a late family emergency. So our committee had to hustle to kind of reorganize a little bit. And so we're going to do kind of a tag team thing, if that's okay. I'm going to participate. Michael Shapiro is going to support. And Fraser Lockhart, I think you're going to take a question. If I can get a thumbs up. Okay, great. So we're going to tag this team this thing going forward. So our charge was to look at the hybrid work environment. And if you go to the next slide. So here's our committee. I'm sorry, please, the previous slide. Here's our committee. And David, you're in the room. I wanted to do a little joke, but I don't want to at risk. You know, there's 4 of us here, so Michael and I are the rookies, as we said. David is a tenured gentleman, tremendous experience. I think they hoodwinked Michael and I into doing this. But we're happy to do it. But again, on all the meetings that I was to participate, David, your experience shone through. So I really don't want your voice not to be heard here. If there's anything that you think you want to add as we go forward, please feel free to offer that. Great mix of folks, both from federal government and obviously from academia and from the private sector. We had a lot of meetings, and I really did benefit and enjoy that one cross meeting we had with Jim's group. So if we go forward, I really think there's opportunities here to surge these 2 issues, because to me they're just intricately connected. Next slide. So I just pulled this out of one of the OPM documents. So Celeste did a lot similar to not recreating the wheel. So there's a lot of research done to try to understand what programs you already have in place. And I just pulled this out of one of the documents. Obviously, we know why we're here. You know, the pandemic happened, you know, it just flipped the world upside down. And now every agency, every entity out there that has a distributed workforce like this is trying to figure out how to recover from that, how to put a situation back in place that's going to continue to be a place where people want to come and work. And like you made that point about people in the future, the passion of that, being able to resource whatever that future is. You know, I think all of those things are connected. So finding that right balance to meet the needs of your workforce, all of those partners, as we work with Kelly and the team, understanding the distributed nature of all your stakeholders through various municipal governments, all these end users who are impacted communities, trying to find that right balance in this new environment with the right investment, is really a difficult challenge, and just trying to appreciate that. And I think one of the things we took away is this will be a continuous process of interaction with that. You're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to make some folks happy and some folks not happy as you're going, and some tough choices will be made at some point that may push people out the door, frankly. So I think that's the charge of leaders, to try to find that balance and stay true to people, stay transparent, keep the communication going, and just, we're on a journey together, obviously. Next slide. So here's the 5 or 6 questions that we were charged with. I would say first, the first 5 were given to us in the charge. The last one was kind of added late into it, and I'll say this term again, I really felt like we didn't address that very well or very thoroughly. I think Josiah came on at a point. We kind of flipped the lens because we spent a lot of time focused on the DOE workforce and not so much the stakeholders in the community. And we were asked late to kind of look at it from the other view, those folks that we're meeting who are in the impacted communities. And I think Josiah brought some thoughts that opened my eyes, and we really didn't treat it fully. And I mean, I personally think there's more to look at there than we were able to capture, and I'm just being honest and frank about that. So as we go through the 5 or 6 questions, Michael is going to address the first 3. Fraser's going to address the 4th one. I'll take the last 2 and then do a wrap-up. So, Michael, over to you. Next slide, please.
Thanks a lot. This was actually a great rookie experience, so working with folks both experienced and less experienced on this work group and on issues that really are as Jake said, these are not unique to DOE, although some aspects of DOE's work lend some unique challenges to this. But the other thing you'll notice, I think, as we look across these kind of 6 sets of recommendations is there's a lot of overlap because these questions really intersect each other in terms of how we work in a hybrid environment. So the first topic was how can EM leverage hybrid and virtual flexibilities to enhance agility and efficiency? And I think the positive message about the challenge facing us is that as a result of the forced march we took through COVID, as organizations, we've discovered and developed tools and ways of working that if used correctly, can strengthen our organization. So instead of debating necessarily remote versus in-person, and facing the reality of the fact that many employees want at least kind of hybrid opportunities, there are things we can do now, and EM can do now, much more flexibly than it could pre-COVID. And so especially given the diverse geographic locations and expertise, with the tools that are available now, it's much easier to bring together ad hoc work groups from across the organization, from different parts of the country, with different expertise to address either on an episodic basis or a regular basis, problems that really require bringing together the diverse talents of the organization. The second point there is that it's not just the agencies that have learned how to work hybridly. Many of our stakeholders have as well. Not all, and we'll get to that point. But again, rather than thinking about it as kind of exclusively virtual, exclusively in person, we recognize that we have limited amounts of time and resources to interact in person with many of our stakeholders. But using the better tools of communication that are available to us now and the skills that we've acquired in working in hybrid environments, it's possible to actually strengthen relationships with stakeholders because instead of having a few infrequent, or in addition to infrequent in-person, we can kind of continue a much more frequent and quality dialogue given the tools are available. Again, and I'm sure DOE, folks are engaged in working through all these practices, so having mechanisms to identify best practices, certainly within DOE and EM, but of course across other federal agencies as well, as was pointed out, provide some real opportunities. Has been pointed out previously, with DOE, each of the organizational elements and geographic units have their own specific sets of challenges and stakeholders. So these are the kinds of adaptations that really require managers and employees in each location to help frame the best ways of folding hybrid work into their workplace. And again, Jake brought this up, and we'll hear more about it later. But always when we do this, we do have to recognize the fact that some of our stakeholders that are critical to our success are facing limitations of technology and mobility. That means that we have to kind of tailor the hybrid environments that we work in to meet their needs as well. So again, we'll hear more about that in a bit. So we can move on to the next slide. Topic 2. How can EM empower federal and contractor employees with efficient workspaces and technology that minimize hybrid workplace challenges? Again, this is a work in progress at EM and elsewhere, I'm sure. One of the first elements is in hybrid environment, meetings are especially challenging. It's much harder to run a good hybrid meeting than it is to run a completely virtual meeting or a completely in-person meeting, as I'm sure we've all encountered. And so meeting space and the quality of meeting rooms is something that can't be skimped on in putting together. So there's always an opportunity to say, well, now that we can work remotely, we can save a lot of space. And that's probably true for many parts of the organization, but certainly meeting spaces and the quality of meeting spaces are things that really can't be sacrificed if you want to make this work. And the use of the proper technology for the kinds of rooms and meetings you have, multiple screens if needed, multiple microphones, cameras, technical support, are all elements of making hybrid meetings as effective as possible. And similarly, make sure the contractors we work with are similarly equipped and our systems work with each other. Again, getting back to the point that one size doesn't fit all, which is a consistent theme across our recommendations. These are the kinds of adaptations that really require teams and organizations at the working level to figure out how best to do this. The other element is that where some employees will be working more regularly in the office, others will be working more remotely. It's perfectly appropriate and I think necessary, and we think necessary, to tailor the space allowances per employee in some ways based on the frequency with which they're in the office. So they're ranging from regular workstations for people who are mostly in the office to hoteling for folks who may only be episodically in the office. Next slide. Best practices to balance mission needs with a flexible hybrid workspace culture. Here, it's really important to focus really on each position and assignment to figure out the specific needs and requirements. And you'll hear more about that in some of the material that's coming under 4. But some of this really will require organizations to rethink how work is being done and what activities truly require or benefit significantly from in-person interaction. There are some things that we think we need to do in person that when you re-examine them with the tools that are available today, you might decide, no, not really, or at least elements of this work can be done just as well in a hybrid environment. One of the things that's critical in